Good evening. I do appreciate the prayers. I- there's an old picture when I was holding my daughter when she was very young. And when I say very young, almost newborn. And my beard had two very, very small patches of gray, but the rest of it was dark and majestic. And she saw that picture one day and she said, "Dad, you're getting old because of all the gray I have now." And I said, "This is all from you." And she pointed at that picture. She goes, "No, see, you have gray there already, and I'm barely even born." And I said, "Well, that gray belongs to your mom. The rest of this is all you." And like Brock said, I have a 10-year-old who is a 10-year-old daughter. My youngest is a girl as well. And I don't think the rest of my beard stands a chance when she hits her teenage years either. So I do appreciate the prayers. I am very thankful for the invite to be with y'all again. It's great to be here. I appreciate your hospitality last time, and I was looking forward to this study with y'all as well. A young man one time called his mother, and he told her that he had met the woman of his dreams. And he said, "I want to do something special for her." So his mother said, "Well, send her some flowers and invite her over for a home cooked meal." And so he said he would do that. And the day after the date was supposed to take place, she called him to see how the date went. And he said it was awful. And she goes, "Well, I thought this was the woman of your dreams. What happened?" He goes, "Well, I sent her flowers like you said, and I invited her over for a home cooked meal, but she refused to cook anything when she got here." And so I say that for this reason. When this topic was assigned, there's not a lot written as far as Sarah goes in this chapter. It's one verse really, and I began to think about how I was going to approach it. And as I was studying, the Bible is chock full of women who have had an influence on society and on the world, and by extension, us today as we study about them. Eve, for example, is called the mother of all the living in Genesis chapter 3. Jochebed, the mother of Moses, was accredited for essentially putting him in the position to be taken into Pharaoh's household. You have the maidservants in the book of Exodus that were defying the decree by Pharaoh to drown any male under the age of 2. The mother of Jesus, Mary, was chosen to be his mother because of her character, and the Bible's very clear about that. Timothy's spoken of very well in the book of Ephesians. And then we go to First Timothy, and we realize that his faith and his character was developed by his mother and his grandmother, Lois and Eunice. You have the Canaanite woman in Matthew chapter 15 who came to Christ to have a request that he heal her daughter. And when Jesus in this conversation says, "Oh, how great is your faith," to this woman, which was a contrast to some of the Jewish encounters that he had, Jewish men encounters that he had as well. And I think Sarah falls into that category as well. Sometimes, and admittedly, I would fall into this category as one who would allow the faith of Abraham to overshadow the faith of Sarah. But I'm glad I was assigned this topic because, based on what the Hebrews author writes about Sarah in this great chapter of faith, Sarah stands alone as an example of faith from which you and I can learn. And so, our goal this evening is essentially to study Sarah's faith, this passage, Sarah's faith, and pull from it lessons that we can learn, both male and female, men and women, young and old, things that we can pull from the example that she set for us. Um, so, without further ado, if you would join me in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to begin reading in verse 11. And there it says, "By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Now, there are a few things we want to point out about this verse, and this verse is going to just serve as the structure of our lesson tonight. And the first part is that phrase where it simply says, um, by faith, Sarah herself. And I want to focus on the word herself. It's the Greek word ate, and it's in there. But what's interesting about the word is it is grammatically unnecessary. In other words, we could leave that word out and it wouldn't change the meaning of the sentence at all, which means that it's there for a different reason than just grammar to make the sentence flow. It's called an emphatic pronoun. And I believe the Holy Spirit put that word in there intentionally. Everything the Holy Spirit did from an inspiration standpoint was intentional. But that word herself there is intentional because he wants to emphatically state that what we're talking about in this particular verse is the faith of Sarah. And I think that's interesting because when you read some of the commentaries on this verse, they'll actually try to argue that the subject of this verse is Abraham, and Sarah is just simply a byproduct of Abraham's faith, because this passage is surrounded by essentially two passages that deal with Abraham's faith. So by that phrase or that emphatic pronoun being there, we know that we're talking about Sarah and a faith that she had. We're not talking about Abraham's faith. We're not even talking about Abraham's faith in conjunction with Sarah's faith. We're talking about Sarah's faith and Sarah's faith alone. Now, when we think about it for just a moment, let's consider her faith, because there is a sense where the faith that Sarah showed is a faith that would have been impossible for Abraham to show. It's unique to only her. And what I mean by that is for this reason. One, she was bearing social and emotional weight of the promise that God had made to Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, he tells Abraham that through his seed a mighty nation would rise, and from that nation would come the Messiah, and the Messiah would bless all nations. So Abraham has to have a child. He's married to Sarah. Up until this point, Sarah has been unable to conceive a child. And so when you imagine Abraham comes home, tells Sarah what the Lord had promised to her, they haven't been able to have children up until this point, you can imagine the burden it would have put on her from an emotional and mental standpoint. In fact, you go to ancient Near Eastern times, honor, purpose, and status in society was dependent on the ability to bear children. Open your Bibles, put your marker there in Hebrews chapter 11, and let's go to Genesis chapter 16. In Genesis chapter 16, we're going to begin reading in verses 1 and 2. And it says there, now Sarah, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing the children. Go unto my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. Now go down to verse 5 and notice what it says. And Sarai said to Abraham, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace. And when she saw that she had conceived, so here Hagar is able to conceive a child, Sarah wasn't. And notice what it says. She looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. And that was common in that day. If a woman was unable to produce children, especially male children, then she bore the social and the emotional brunt of that incapability. It was misinterpreted as punishment. One scholar wrote, barrenness was a shame and reproach in Israel. It was interpreted as divine punishment, or at least a sign of divine displeasure. Okay, so her not being able to have children put a stigma on her. It wasn't the correct stigma, but people assumed that she had done something wrong and God was punishing her as a result of it. Civil law, outside of God's law, just civil law in general, the Code of Hammurabi said a man was able to divorce his wife if she was not able to produce children. Now, he had to provide, give her money as a result of it, but that was a reason to divorce your wife at the time, at that culture. So she bore the social and emotional weight of not being able to have children, yet God promising that Abraham would eventually have a child. The other thing we need to understand too is that at a time, barren was a part of her identity. It was a characteristic about her that this promise required something about her to step out of her nature. Now, I think she would have given up this part of her character, but at the moment that God promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, part of her character was that she was unable to have children. If we go over to Genesis 11:30, it just simply says, "Now Sarai was barren; she had no child." So the Bible uses that characteristic to describe her. But I want us to notice something in chapter 17. In chapter 17, I want you to notice what it says in verse 15 of Genesis. It says, "And God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name." Okay, so now God is changing the name of Sarah. Earlier in verse 5, if you go up to 17 and verse 5, notice what takes place there. "No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be called Abraham, for I have made you the father of a multitude of nations." So name changes. When God changes the name of someone, there are a couple reasons for doing that. Number one is it's a change in identity. I'll give you an example. Jacob, for example. Jacob, given to him, name given to him by his mother, means the holder of the hill. So, Jacob is a twin. Esau was his twin. Esau was the first. And we have record of him grabbing the hill of Esau as they're being born. And so Jacob, she was given the name Jacob, which means holder of the hill. His name was changed by God to Israel, which means he who struggles with God. And when was that given to him? Well, it was after he wrestled the angel of the Lord, which we find out later was the second member of the pre-incarnate Christ who wrestled with God. So you see the description, the identity there given in the name change. Abraham, for example, Abram means exalted father. Abraham means the father of nations. And so he makes this covenant with Abraham. I'm going to make a mighty nation from your seed. And he changes his name to Abraham to seal that covenant. Sarah, in verse 15, receives that name change. But what's interesting about this is that Sarai and Sarah, some will argue means princess, both of them mean princess. However, when you really kind of study, most scholars believe that the word Sarai actually means contentious, and that the word Sarah means princess or ruler. And Sarah kind of sticks in line with that name or that thought that she would be a mother of a mighty nation, just as Abraham would be the father of a mighty nation. Now, I say that for this reason. Look at verse 16. It says, this is God speaking to Abraham about Sarah, "I will bless her, and moreover, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her." Now, what's important to note is this. When God changes his name and he's changing the identity of Sarah, and he changes the identity of Abraham, at this particular moment, Abraham is already a father. He's already had a child with Hagar. So for him to be an exalted father and then have his name changed to the father of nations, it's kind of an identity that he already possessed at the time, correct? However, when he changes the name of Sarah and makes this covenant with her, and he essentially changes the character of her or her identity with this name, she hasn't had any children. She's not a mother. And so there's a sense where, from Sarah's perspective, she has to embrace this new identity before her body ever confirmed it. Now consider that for a moment. Your household, wherever you're living at this particular time, they know you as Sarai, which means contentious. You read about Sarah throughout the Old Testament, and it's fitting to a degree. And then her name changes to Sarah, which means princess, implying a mother of nations, and yet she has no children. What do you think is going to be the response by those who are looking at her, especially if they have that cultural view of her based on her barrenness? It's going to be a different type of opinion, isn't it? So she has to embrace an identity that her body has not yet fulfilled or confirmed. Number three, her body would have to bear the brunt of God's promise, not Abraham's. She was 65 years old in Genesis chapter 12 when God made the promise to her. When she sent Hagar into Abraham in order to have the child, she was 76 years old. So she tried for 11 years to have a child, finally sent Hagar in because she didn't think it was going to happen. It wasn't until she was 90 years old that she conceived uh, Isaac. 2.5 decades. Now, if a woman walked in 65 years old and says she was pregnant tonight, what would come into our mind? One, first, we might have some doubt that she was pregnant, right? But let's just say she was, she can confirm it. What would the questions then be? A, would she be able to carry the baby to full term? Obviously, it'd be a high risk pregnancy, wouldn't it? Two, we would wonder or be concerned if her body would be able to survive the labor process of birthing that child. If she was to take it, and could not only her body endure it, but also remember, we're not talking about modern medicine today, could the child endure it as well? And so when God makes this promise, she not only has to have faith that A, he's going to make it possible that she can conceive, but B, he's going to preserve her body and the body of Isaac as they grow through the birth process and as she delivers him. Is it uncommon at this time for a woman to give birth to a child and the mother die while the child survives? Absolutely. So that all those things had to come into her mind. I by no means am trying to call Sarah a farm animal, but have y'all heard Aesop's fable? It's a fable. I don't know if it's Aesop's or not, but it's a fable that basically talks about a cow, chicken, and a pig who want to do something nice for the farmer because he does so much to take care of them. And so the chicken says, I think we should cook breakfast. And he says, I'll provide the eggs. And they look to the cow, and the cow and says, you provide the milk. And then they turn to the pig and says, you provide the bacon. And then they begin to question the pig when he is hesitant about this. And they ask him why. And he says, well, you two are invested. I would have to be committed. And when we look at this situation, Sarah would have to be committed. Abraham was invested. I'm not trying to downplay his faith at all, but he was invested in this, whereas Sarah had to be committed. Her body was going to bear the brunt of this promise. Lessons learned, real quick. I know many whose faith was a result, and in my personal life, my faith has been strengthened by women. My mother, my mother-in-law, my grandmothers. We can all talk about women who have had an impact on our faith. My mother-in-law's mother-in-law's father would let the air out of the car tires or unhook the battery or take something out of the car so she couldn't start the car on Sunday morning. And she would walk to worship. Sometimes we'll catch a ride, sometimes people pick her up. but she wasn't going to miss worship as a result of it, and provided that example for my mother-in-law, who has in turn, provided an example for my wife and myself and my children and so forth. So we learn from Sarah that women, the faith of women can have an impact on us. It's a unique faith. Number two, we read that she was not rewarded for her faith, or her faith was not, or she's not in Hebrews chapter. I'll say it like this: she's not in this great chapter of faith because she was Abraham's wife. She's in this chapter of faith because of her own faith, unique to her. All right, there's an instance, where men and women's faith are different. They're unique, right? You take 1 Corinthians 11, verse 3, where it talks about the man is subject to Christ, the woman is subject to the man, Christ is subject to God. Our faith has to operate in different avenues within the church. And when you look at a congregation that works and you see men and women operating the way God would have them, and you see them operating within the confines of how God would have men operate and serve, and how God would have women operate and serve, you see a congregation that flourishes as a result of it. A man has to operate from an authoritative space as faith. A woman has to operate from a submissive faith. When children see a father's faith that complements the mother's, and a mother's faith that complements the father, they have a great example of what it means to grow up in a Christian home, and they have a great understanding of how the church should work as a result of it. I'm glad that the church isn't operating simply on the influence of just men, because I know, and we'll talk about this in a little more detail, but it'd be in trouble. Women are very, very vital to a congregation's success. And so unborrowed faith will be tested in unique ways. Sarah leaves us a pattern that we can follow. Sarah teaches us how to take ownership of our faith. Number two, it says in Hebrews 11, verse 11, that she received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past age. Hers was a faith that confronted her reality. That word received is in the active voice, which means that she was responsible for acquiring it. Again, it kind of goes back to the idea this was her personal faith. The word dunamos is used for the word strength. That's a word that's used to describe God in Matthew 26 and Mark 14. The gospel, I'm not ashamed of the power. The gospel of Christ, for is the power, the dunamos of God unto salvation. Romans 1 and verse 4, Jesus was proven to be the Son of God by the power of the resurrection. Dunamos is used there as where here it's used to describe her faith as being more powerful than her age or her barrenness. And again, let's go back to Genesis and let's look at chapter 18. And begin reading with me in verse 9. It says, "They said to him, 'Where is Sarah your wife?'" So Abraham has guest. One of those guests is Christophany. It's the second member of the Godhead, I believe, conversing with him. And he says, "Where is Sarah your wife?" And he said, "She is in the tent." The Lord said, "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife shall have a son." And Sarah was listening at the tent behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. The way of women had ceased to be with Sarah. So Sarah laughed to herself, saying, "After I am worn out, and my Lord is old, shall I have pleasure?" The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Shall I indeed bear a child now that I am old?'" Verse 14, "Is anything too hard for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you about this time next year, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied it, saying, "I did not laugh, for she was afraid." He said, "No, but you did laugh." And I think when we think about Sarah, this is particularly in this area of conceiving Isaac, this is the section of scripture that comes to our mind first, is that she laughed when God told her what was going to happen. Consider, I want us to really just put the circumstances surrounding her faith in this moment and in this promise into perspective and what it had to overcome in order for Isaac's conception to be a reality. Number one, it had to overcome her past. They've been trying for decades. God makes the promise when she's 65 years old. They try for 11 years, nothing happens. They try after Ishmael is born. It's still another 14, 15 years after that, um, or 13 or 14 years after that before she conceives again. 2.5 decades after she was promised, after Abraham was promised that his seed would bless the nations, did she actually conceive. That's a lot. Think of where you were 25 years ago and everything that's happened since then. That's an entire lifetime. And so it had to overcome her past, her barren body on it. It had to overcome her age. It had to overcome her skepticism. She was skeptical. That's what this passage points out. And so there's a lot of things that her faith has to overcome at this particular moment. At this moment, she confronts reality. And again, that's why I'm glad that she's included in Hebrews chapter 11. From strictly a medical standpoint, what we read about here in Genesis chapter 18, her bearing a child is impossible. Not only is she barren and past the age of having children, but Abraham himself is past the age of having children. When we go over to Romans chapter 4 and we read 17 through 21, and we won't go over there and read it, but it's marking the faith of Abraham. And one of the things that Paul says by inspiration of the Holy Spirit is that Abraham was good as dead. Not meaning his health was deteriorating, but the fact that he was unable to produce children on his own was at that point. Now it says he had faith throughout, but here's the point we want to draw from this. Sometime between what we read about here in Genesis chapter 18 and what we read about in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 11, there was a change in her perspective or a change in her mind that took place. And we'll talk about that here in just a moment. Sometimes we think about faith, and maybe we're even guilty of this. I know we've probably heard it, but there's kind of a ultimatum on our faith that sometimes we put on it. If this happens, then I'll believe. And Sarah very easily could have fallen into that category. It may have been that at the beginning. I'll start to have this faith that God will actually bring this child when I'm pregnant. But that's one thing I hope that we get through all of this study tonight, is that this faith preceded the evidence that God would eventually give her. This faith was based on simply the fact that God said, this is how it's going to be. And again, if we're not careful, sometimes we try to skirt our faith around the circumstances, don't we? Sometimes we try to put a disclaimer on the faith. I'll give more. If I get this promotion, then I'll start giving more on Sunday morning. Well, the question is, well, what do we give with what we have now? And we can make that application in a lot of areas as well. But her faith leaned into God, into his power, into his fidelity, and rather trying to avert the circumstance, Sarah's faith, if you allow me to say it this way, plows through the circumstance. And we'll see that here in just a moment. Lessons learned: faith operates within a reality. It does not remove the reality. And I think that's something that's important. Sometimes our faith, our worship, our joy, our hope has to be sustained even though our circumstances never change. And too many people lose their faith because they look at faith as transactional. I need to have faith. If I have faith, then this should go away. God's never promised us to take that circumstance away from us. He has promised us to deliver us ultimately from it. But there may be some things you and I have to deal with for a lifetime, and our faith has to withstand the entire lifetime as a result of it. Number two, another one is the faith of women, and I want to highlight the value of women in the church, because I don't want, there's a misconception that the church is misogynistic because of the usurping the authority of man, 1 Timothy chapter 2 and all that, and we don't value women. That's not the case. We obey God first and foremost, but women are valuable. I give you an example. I was riding in a car with my buddy um, when I was in high school. He had two sisters. We were in basically like a minivan. Two sisters, his mother and his father, and then my buddy and me in the back. And we came by a panhandler, a homeless individual who was asking for money, and the mother wanted the the husband to give money, and he did, because she requested it. But he started to complain. He's probably going to spend that money on drugs or alcohol, whatever it was. And the mother was like, no, maybe he needs food, and we don't know his circumstance. We don't know his here. The sisters, and you had this essentially between these two families, the men in the family thinking this man was going to do very cynical in their approach to this man, whereas in the women were very empathetic to his needs. I didn't have an opinion. I was just glad to see that other families bicker like my family did. So we were cool. But I think it's a perfect illustration of the balance uh, that women bring. Men are cynical by nature. That's just how we're wired. Women are empathetic by nature, and it's good to balance it out. In fact, I think if we could tally all the prayers that have been made on our behalf, at least for me, I would say the top of my list is probably a woman. My mother, my grandmother, my wife. I mean, they give us the benefit of the doubt sometimes, even when we don't deserve it. And I know uh, that's a benefit because of their faith. Their faith holds on sometimes when the faith of men necessarily doesn't. So, like Sarah, we don't want to wait for all the evidence. We want to be moved by His word. And I think it's a lesson we all can learn, that we need to start setting things in motion long before the evidence presents itself of success. That's faith. That's the faith Sarah had. And finally, it closes out and it says, she judged him faithful who had promised. Hers was a faith that rested on her judgment. The nuance of this word considered means it's in the middle tone or middle voice, which means she held an active and passive role in this. Now, the passive role would come from the standpoint of God giving her reasons or evidence to believe based on this. I think personally, when he said, "Why did you laugh?" that was evidence that he was talking about something, that he was someone different than just a man making a claim. He was proving that he knows her better than she knows herself. Uh, she put the trust in God and not her circumstances. We see that as we've talked about. I believe, because you remember in verse 14, he asked, "Is anything too hard for the Lord?" I believe at that moment, Sarah went out and she answered that question. Now, we don't have any record of Sarah um, being visited in a dream, being visited by an angel to tell her something. We don't have her transcending like Isaiah or John for the book of Revelation, or Paul into the heavenly places and that. We just simply have her in her situation, more than likely weighing the evidence, reasoning that God is faithful, and then changing her view from skepticism and fully leaning into the promise that God made 25 years before this instance. Go back to Hebrews chapter 11 with me and read with me again verse 11 and 12. By faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive when she was past age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. And look at that word in verse 12. Therefore, Circle that. Because we know therefore ties what's about to follow with what's stated, right? So everything that's going to follow in verse 12 is attributed to the faith of Sarah. Notice what it says. From one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants as many as the stars of heaven and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. And the point we want to draw with this is that because of Sarah's faith, Abraham's faith was able to operate. There's a heavy implication here that Abraham, there's evidence that Abraham's faith never wavered. Paul tells us that in Romans. But Abraham's faith was dependent upon Sarah's faith. And I believe it wasn't until Sarah's faith fell in line with Abraham's faith that Isaac was conceived. And again, we see that complement one another. I also think so we see that influence that it has, but let's go back to Genesis and we'll close with this thought. The influence that Sarah had on her son Isaac. Isaiah chapter 24. Sarah has died up until this point, and in Genesis chapter 24, Abraham wants essentially Isaac to find a wife. Now, consider the pressure on Isaac at this point. Sarah has passed, so she's died. He's the only son. So now the reality that the seed promise goes through him has set in. Okay? Well, he's not married at this point. And notice what it says in verse 67. So he meets Rachel. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, his mother, and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So point being is imagine here he is, the bloodline comes through me. I'm not even married. I don't even have a wife yet. Well, here chapter 24, he finds the wife, and it's that, okay, check. I have a wife, we can start having children, and that seed promise that God promised in chapter 12 can continue on through me. Because he didn't have any brothers, right? Well, then we go on into chapter 21. And notice, or I'm sorry, chapter 25, and we're going to read verse 21. It says, and Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife. Who's praying here? Remember, it's Isaac, okay? Because she was barren. And the Lord granted, what's it say there? Whose prayer? His prayer. And Rebekah, his wife, conceived. So he's married. Now his wife is barren. So that seed promise, again, is, if you look at it just from a world perspective, is put in jeopardy. And what's Isaac do? Isaac goes to God in prayer. And as a result of his prayer, she's able to conceive. Now, where do you think Isaac gained this confidence in God to approach him for this particular reason? I don't think it was Abraham. I think his mother, sharing the story of how he was conceived, gave Jacob the confidence to approach God in this situation so his wife would be able to conceive. The influence of Sarah is, in my opinion, very evident in this passage. Thank you guys so much for your attention.